200 sorties. That's roughly what a single day of coordinated strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure would have required. Refineries, power plants, the electrical grid feeding Tehran itself. That was the plan sitting on President Trump's desk this weekend. Not a symbolic strike, not a one-off. A sustained bombing campaign against the Iranian energy grid, with senior officials reportedly discussing something as drastic as cutting electricity to the capital city entirely. And then, in the span of about 18 hours, it didn't happen. Trump called it off. Iran is calling the reason a lie. Saudi Arabia is calling it diplomacy. And by Monday afternoon, the United States and Iran are supposed to be sitting back down at the negotiating table. So what actually happened here? What changed the president's mind in under a day after he just told the country the U.S. was locked and loaded at a level of force not seen since World War II? That's what we're breaking down. And the most underreported piece of this story isn't the missiles that didn't fly. It's the phone call that stopped them. I spent a decade and a half flying the F-15E Strike Eagle in combat, and before that, I flew air shows with the Thunderbirds. I've sat in a cockpit with a strike package built against exactly this kind of target set. Energy infrastructure, grid nodes, refineries. So when I talk today about what a bombing campaign like this actually requires, and what calling one off at the last minute actually costs, I'm not guessing. I built this channel on one promise, and I'm going to repeat it every time. I will tell you what is confirmed, what is developing, and where there is genuine debate. No speculation dressed up as fact, no filling gaps with drama. Just what we actually know, laid out straight. So let's rebuild the timeline, because you need the last 5 months to understand why this weekend mattered so much. This war did not start this weekend, and it didn't even start in July. It started on February 28th, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated, surprise airstrike campaign against Iranian military and government targets. That opening strike included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with a number of senior Iranian officials. That is an extraordinary event on its own, the removal of a head of state through direct military action. And it set the entire 5-month chain reaction in motion. Iran's response was immediate, and it targeted the global economy at its most sensitive pressure point, the Strait of Hormuz. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, declared the strait closed to what they called unfriendly nations, and began enforcing that closure with naval mines, boardings, and direct attacks on merchant shipping. For context on why that mattered so much, before this war, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas moved through that single waterway. Shut it down, even partially, and you're not just threatening two countries, you're threatening fuel prices on every continent. To understand why Iran reached for the strait specifically, you have to understand what the strait is. It's a narrow choke point between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, and it is functionally the only maritime exit for a huge share of Gulf oil production. You cannot reroute around it without adding thousands of miles and weeks of transit time. Iran doesn't need to sink every ship to make the strait unusable. The IRGC's approach was to make transit unpredictable. They transmitted warnings over VHF radio directly to commercial vessels. They laid sea mines, and by early March, they'd formally declared the strait closed to what they called unfriendly nations, meaning only Iran-approved shipping could pass. The British Royal Navy said publicly that closure wasn't legally binding, but that safety could not be guaranteed, which in practice meant insurers and shipping companies pulled back anyway. That's the core dynamic of this entire war. Iran doesn't need naval superiority to hurt the global economy. It just needs enough uncertainty that shipping companies decide the risk isn't worth it. The U.S. response was to launch what's now being referred to as the Strait of Hormuz campaign, an aerial operation beginning March 19th aimed at reopening the strait by force, conducted by the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy, and Israeli Air Force together. Early results were significant. By March 9th, President Trump was already claiming the Iranian military had been effectively destroyed and the strait reopened, at one point even floating the idea of the U.S. taking direct control of the waterway and asking NATO and China for help protecting shipping. Both declined. Around the same period, the U.S. also ran a formal naval blockade of Iranian ports, which lasted from mid-April into late May. By early April, after roughly 5 weeks of continuous fighting, the U.S. and Iran, with Israel included, agreed to a ceasefire. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. What followed instead was months of brinkmanship, with both sides testing the edges of that ceasefire without technically breaking it outright, including, notably, a Senate confirmation hearing where the military's ongoing role in keeping the strait open was raised as a direct policy concern, underlining that Washington itself didn't consider this settled. It's worth noting this wasn't the first time Washington and Tehran had come close to this exact brink. Back in January, Trump had credited a decision by Iran to cancel a mass wave of scheduled executions. over 800 of them by his count, as a factor in holding off on military strikes at that time, a sign that even before the February war began, this relationship was already being managed through a mix of threats, concessions, and last-minute reversals. That pattern, threat, pause, uncertain resolution, is one you're going to see repeat itself over and over as we move through this timeline, and it's worth keeping in the back of your mind. Then, on June 14th, mediators announced something more concrete, a formal memorandum of understanding, an MOU, intended to bring the entire conflict to a negotiated end within 60 days of signing. If you're doing the math, that 60-day window put the deadline right around the middle of August. For about 3 weeks, that framework mostly held. Then, in July, it came apart. Iran resumed strikes on cargo ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and on July 6th and 7th specifically, 3 vessels were attacked. That's the detail that matters here, because that's the moment President Trump publicly said he considered the truce over. From that point forward, the pattern accelerated. The U.S. ramped up strikes on Iranian assets. This past Wednesday, the White House confirmed what Trump himself described as a heavy wave of strikes targeting Iran directly, the most significant escalation since the ceasefire technically collapsed. According to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Center and reporting from the region, Iranian forces have continued targeting shipping and, more recently, claimed strikes on U.S. radar and air defense systems based in Bahrain and Kuwait. A tanker was hit by what the United Kingdom described only as an unknown projectile near the strait within the last several days. This is not a cold conflict. This is a hot one, with strikes landing on both sides, right up until the weekend we're about to walk through. If you're new to the channel, this is exactly the kind of moving target story where you want to be subscribed with notifications turned on, because this situation is not resolving in a single news cycle. It's shifting day to day, sometimes hour to hour, and I'd rather you hear it from someone walking you through the actual sourcing than catch a headline stripped of context. All right, into the weekend itself, because this is where the real story is. Wednesday matters here, because it's the immediate trigger for everything that follows. The White House described that day's operation as a heavy wave of strikes, launched as a direct retaliatory response to what officials said was an attempted Iranian attack on U.S. military positions the day before. Think about the sequencing there. This isn't the U.S. initiating a fresh offensive out of nowhere. This is a retaliation and response cycle that's been running since the ceasefire broke down in July, each side answering the last move rather than either one making a clean opening strike. Since that Wednesday wave, there haven't been further reported U.S. strikes inside Iranian territory, but the broader region kept absorbing hits. The IRGC reported targeting U.S. radar and air defense systems in Bahrain and Kuwait, and separately claimed strikes on 2 vessels transiting the strait, with a statement warning that the enemy must prepare for more decisive and crushing waves of drone and missile attacks. A tanker was hit by an unidentified projectile near the strait around this same window, according to the United Kingdom's own reporting on the incident. So even in the days where no U.S. strikes on Iran itself were confirmed, the region was still absorbing near-daily attacks from multiple directions. Saturday. This is the day everything pivots. Multiple outlets, including CBS News and Axios, had already reported in the days prior that the United States and Israel were preparing a major bombing campaign against Iranian energy infrastructure, refineries, power generation, the grid, with a potential launch window opening that weekend. Axios specifically cited a U.S. official saying Trump was seriously weighing strikes within days as a pressure tool to force Tehran back into ceasefire negotiations on American terms. This wasn't a symbolic gesture being discussed. Senior officials reportedly floated cutting electricity to Tehran itself as part of the plan. That's a strike package built to produce strategic paralysis, not just tactical damage. And if it had gone forward with Israel rejoining direct combat, which was also on the table, you're looking at a serious risk of Iran responding with renewed missile strikes into Israeli territory. This was escalation on a scale beyond anything since the February opening strikes, and the White House itself confirmed Trump was actively weighing the new strikes, even as it urged Americans in the Middle East toward heightened vigilance and possible travel disruption. An unusual pairing of signals, threatening massive force publicly while simultaneously preparing the diplomatic and civilian safety apparatus for what that force might trigger in return. And Trump, publicly, leaned into that escalation rather than away from it. On Saturday, he declared the United States locked and loaded and ready to go against the Islamic Republic of Iran, at what he described as a level of force not seen since World War II. That's the rhetorical peak of this entire 5-month conflict. Read that statement in isolation, and you'd assume strikes were imminent, possibly already in motion. But behind that public statement, a different conversation was happening. According to CNN, sourced to 4 people familiar with the matter, plus a regional source, President Trump spoke by phone with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that same Saturday. This is the pivot point of the entire story, and it's worth being precise about what we actually know versus what's being inferred. The Saudi press agency released an official readout of that call. In it, the Crown Prince stressed the need to prioritize dialogue to reduce escalation and the importance of exerting all possible efforts to achieve calm that paves the way for diplomatic solutions, preserves the region's security and stability, and prevents a wider conflict. CBS News separately confirmed that bin Salman had reached out specifically to try to dissuade Trump from launching the new round of strikes. That's a direct, named on-record intervention from one of America's closest Gulf allies, made hours before Trump reversed course. Late Saturday night, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was canceling the planned attack. His own words, he had been asked to hold off on any attack, as agreement has been reached with Iran and other Middle Eastern countries on the framework of an agreement. He described that framework as covering the immediate and full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and an end to what he called Iran's nuclear threat, and said Israel had joined that commitment. Trump framed the decision as being for the future benefit of the world, while also making clear this reprieve is conditional. His words, subject to being able to rapidly make a deal. According to a regional official involved in the mediation effort, the actual proposal on the table calls for the U.S. and Iran to return to formal negotiations and covers not just the Strait, but a halt to attacks across the broader region, including strikes by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq against Gulf countries and Jordan. President Trump has since said those negotiations with Iran are set to begin Monday afternoon. Now, here's where I want you to slow down with me, because this is the part that separates surface-level coverage from an actual analysis, and it's the sharpest insight in this entire story. Iran's response to all of this has not been gratitude, and it has not been confirmation. Mehr, a semi-official Iranian news agency with government sponsorship, dismissed Trump's version of events outright, citing unnamed Iranian military officials who called the claim simply a new lie. As of the most recent reporting, Iran has not issued an official government confirmation that any deal framework actually exists. So you have an American president publicly describing a done deal with defined terms, strait reopening, nuclear threat resolution, Israeli buy-in, and you have the other party to that supposed deal calling it fabricated. Both of those things are true statements about what's been said. They can't both be true statements about what's actually been agreed to. That gap is the strategic question sitting at the center of this entire weekend, and it's worth understanding through the lens of doctrine, not just headlines. From Washington's side, there's a clear strategic logic to using the threat of overwhelming force as diplomatic leverage. You build the most credible strike package possible, you publicize it, and you use its existence as pressure to move the other side back to the table without actually having to execute it. That's classic coercive diplomacy, and it's been a recurring pattern with this administration going back to earlier phases of this same conflict. Back in March, Trump gave Iran a 48-hour ultimatum to reopen the strait, then delayed planned strikes on energy infrastructure by 10 days, citing ongoing talks Iran denied were happening at the time. If that pattern is repeating, then this weekend's cancellation isn't necessarily a sign the crisis is ending. It may be a sign the pressure campaign is working exactly as designed, using the credible threat of a strike as the actual weapon rather than the strike itself. Look at the specific language Trump used in March versus this weekend, because the pattern really is strikingly consistent. In March, he gave a 48-hour ultimatum, warned he'd strike energy plants, starting with the biggest one first, then a day later announced a 5-day delay citing good and productive conversations, a claim Iran denied at the time, just as Iran is denying the current deal framework now. That's not a coincidence of phrasing. That's the same coercive diplomacy playbook run twice, 5 months apart, against the same target set, energy infrastructure, with the same justification, talks are progressing, and the same denial from the other side. If you're a betting person, and you've watched this pattern before, that history should shape how much weight you put on this weekend's framework holding through Monday.